On December 18, 2025, a plane crash brought the lives of Greg Biffle and his entire family to an end. The man who had conquered some of NASCAR's most punishing circuits was remembered not only for speed or victories, but for his quiet demeanor, discipline, and the way he consistently placed family life above the spotlight. The news appeared briefly across bulletins, yet its reverberations lingered, because Greg Biffle had long existed within the racing community, not as a loud symbol, but as a steady presence amid relentless pace and pressure. The tracks are still there. The race calendar continues, but the familiar rhythm suddenly falters. The prevailing feeling is not shock so much as emptiness, like a reliable support, quietly removed from the foundation without warning. Greg Biffle never sought the center through grand words. He made his presence felt through discipline, composure, and the habit of finishing what needed to be done, then leaving quietly. And so, when the accident occurred, what stood out most, clear and painful, was not the technical details of the disaster, but an irreversible truth. Greg Biffle, his wife, and their children, an entire family, were lost on the same flight. From that moment, his story needs to be reconsidered in a different order, beginning with the man and the private life behind the wheel before returning to speed, the track, or the triumphs he once reached. Greg Biffle was born on December 23, 1969 in Vancouver, Washington, and grew up in Camas, a small town in the Pacific Northwest of the United States. There, the simple, steady rhythm of a working-class community formed the backdrop of his childhood. Unglamorous, unassuming, yet sufficient to cultivate the practicality and endurance of a boy who would later enter the world of speed. His father, Garland Jack Biffle II, worked steadily, spoke little, and existed more as a model of labor than as someone who instructed through words. His mother, Sally Fry, kept the household running with a consistent daily rhythm, neither imposing nor overly involved. Greg had one older brother, Jeffrey. The two were not close in the sense of sharing feelings or confiding in one another. They grew up side by side, learning not to intrude, not to demand, and not to lean on each other when difficulties arose. In that environment, Greg learned early that attention was not something readily given. At TEO school, he often remained on the margins of central groups, not because he was excluded, but because he saw no reason to push his way in. Greg observed more than he spoke. When faced with conflict, he did not react immediately. When misunderstood, he did not rush to explain himself. This made it easy for others to label him distant, even cold, an image that would follow him for a long time, despite the fact that Greg never actively cultivated it. Within the family and beyond it, responsibility was not conveyed through lengthy lessons, but through an unspoken code. Everyone was expected to fulfill their part. Completing even a small task rarely earned praise. Fatigue was seldom accepted as a reason to stop. During his high school years, Greg worked after class at an engine machine shop owned by a friend of his father. He dismantled engines, breathed in the smell of gasoline and oil, listened to metal, and learned to recognize when something was off before it had time to become broken. That skill accompanied another instinct, the habit of pushing speed beyond limits. In a small town, Greg's car quickly became familiar to the police. Late-night drives through the streets, repeated speeding incidents, and a string of citations eventually led to his license being suspended for a period of time. It was a phase in which Greg drove constantly, but had nowhere legal to contain his competitive impulse. The turning point came in the way his family handled things, through a concise decision that required no explanation. His father took Greg to Portland Speedway. The oval track on a Friday night did not feel like a dream suddenly illuminated. It felt more like a framework of discipline placed directly in front of him. There, speed was no longer mischief, It was something that carried responsibility to others, to rules, to the surface of the track, and to one's own margin for error. The following week, Greg bought a 1974 Ford Torino from a classified ad. Father and son stripped the car down, installed a roll cage, reworked the engine, and entered it in the street stock class. There was no initiation ritual, no sense of deciding to pursue anything. There was simply a gate opening, one where every movement had a cost, and where continuing to race depended entirely on the ability to keep both the car and one's mind under control. That foundation followed Greg beyond commas. As he moved from short tracks toward larger systems, he carried with him not a prepackaged narrative, but a habit forged in the machine shop and on Friday nights in Portland, placing himself in environments that tolerated no deviation, and letting results speak in place of explanation. By the mid-1990s, while many drivers of his generation were already embedded in NASCAR's youth development programs, Greg's path unfolded differently. He did not come to racing through a carefully nurtured dream, but through a practical question. How far could he operate once speed became governed by rules, structure, and consequences? Short tracks across the Pacific Northwest became his starting point. No bright lights, no institutional backing, just the car, the asphalt, and a single requirement: finish the race without losing control. For Greg, this was not a breakthrough moment, but a logical continuation of a life accustomed to functioning within limits, where staying upright always mattered more than being noticed. In the winter of 1995, that choice led Greg to the NASCAR Winter Heat Series, a punishing competition where cold weather, unpredictable surfaces, and a dense schedule forced drivers to prioritize control over ambition. In that environment, Greg did not stand out through daring overtakes. He kept a steady rhythm, avoided mistakes, and finished each race with the car intact. When the season ended with him taking the overall championship, the result did not feel explosive. It felt like confirmation that his approach could hold. It was here that a crucial movement behind the scenes began to take shape. Benny Parsons, a former NASCAR driver and veteran commentator, noticed Greg not because of the victory itself, but because of how that victory was achieved. He introduced Greg to Jack Roush with a brief professional observation rather than an emotional endorsement. He doesn't do anything extra. In a system where a small mistake can end a career, that assessment carried particular weight. In 1996, Greg made his first appearances in the Winston West Series and began testing himself in races within the national system. Finishing positions were not yet the focus, but a defining line gradually became clear. Greg rarely lost control of his car. He finished races, accumulated data, and earned the trust of those watching him through a technical lens. There were no major titles, but he was increasingly regarded as a driver you could hand a car to, a quiet yet very real standard within NASCAR. By 1997, while competing in the NASCAR Northwest Series, his connection with local fans became more visible. The Most Popular Driver award did not come from dominant victories, but from the way Greg carried himself on track. Serious, unshowy, and consistently respectful of the sport. It was the first time he was recognized not only for results, but for how he entered the profession. Slow, steady, and without excess. In those early seasons, Greg Biffle was not spoken of as a driver full of promise. He was seen as someone who could get it done, a safe option, the kind of personnel teams relied on when they needed a race completed without trouble. There were periods when Greg Biffle disappeared from the racing calendar without announcement, not to rest and not to escape pressure. He used his skills as a pilot to reach isolated areas, transporting people and supplies out of danger during natural disasters. There were no media crews accompanying him, no staged images. Those flights never appeared in performance statistics. They brought no titles or rankings. To Greg, they were simply work that needed to be done, approached the same way he treated every race. Prepare properly, do it right, and leave once the task was complete. What stood out was not the relief work itself, but the attitude surrounding it. Greg did not speak of it as charity. He did not turn it into an inspirational story. In his view of the world, having the ability to help meant an obligation to use it. No additional justification required. There were moments when personal boundaries were placed in situations that caused outsiders to pause and look more closely. Those questions were not large enough to define Greg as a whole, but they were enough to reveal another side of control. When prolonged discipline begins to brush up against the intimate spaces of private life. Greg did not offer public explanations, nor did he turn those moments into narratives of self-defense. He chose to move forward, as he did with most things that could not be solved through technique or strategy. That silence did not make him more flawless, but it left behind a different image. A person who accepted responsibility and who did not stand apart from the very human imperfections of private life. Greg did not change his driving style. He did not raise his risk threshold. He did not adjust himself to attract attention. The only thing that changed was time, and the fact that he did not fall out of rhythm from one season to the next. While other drivers revealed their limits under sustained pressure, Greg maintained a steady line, precise situational awareness, and something rarely highlighted but crucial in NASCAR: the ability to bring the car to the finish intact. By the late 1990s, what had once been seen as a lack of personality began to turn into a different kind of challenge. Teams no longer asked whether Greg could win. They began facing another question instead. How do you beat a driver who almost never makes mistakes? The pressure no longer rested on Greg, but shifted to the rest of the system: strategy, pit crews, and the competitive rhythm of his rivals. As Greg Biffle moved into higher divisions, what changed was not his driving style, but the position he occupied within a team's structure. He was no longer viewed as a driver who had to prove his worth race by race, but as a stabilizing anchor capable of carrying an entire season. From the early 2000s onward, Greg's presence took on a different weight. Not someone who came to disrupt, but someone who kept the system operating on tempo. The year 2000 marked the moment Greg Biffle stepped out of the category of reliable prospect and became a force of consequence within NASCAR. With 5 wins that season, he captured the NASCAR Craftsman Truck Series Championship, his first national title, and also Jack Roush's first Truck Series championship. This was more than an individual achievement. It marked the first time a team structure was built around Greg and ran cleanly through an entire season without losing rhythm. From that point on, Greg was no longer seen as a fill-in driver, but as someone who could carry an entire season to the finish. When Greg moved to the Xfinity Series in 2001, he competed full-time in a harsher environment, one where consistency was no longer a rare advantage, but a minimum requirement. He earned 5 wins, claimed Rookie of the Year honors, and finished 4th overall. Those numbers did not come from a brief surge of brilliance, but from an ability to hold rhythm across a punishing schedule. In 2002, Greg took another step forward: 4 wins, 20 top 5 finishes, and the Xfinity Series championship. It was his second national NASCAR title in 3 years, a trajectory rare enough to need no further validation. Greg entered the Cup Series in 2003 with a different standing. He was neither a driver on trial nor a name protected by promise. In an arena where every deviation is magnified, Greg did not try to make his mark through shock moments. He did something harder. He appeared consistently within the competitive group, kept the car in a state capable of winning at any time, and forced rivals to account for his presence, even when he was not leading. The victory at the Pepsi 400 at Daytona quickly confirmed that reality. Not as a sudden explosion, but as a statement of capability. Greg could stand firm at the very center of NASCAR's most unforgiving stage. Poles at the Daytona 500, wins on high-speed tracks like Michigan and Homestead, and finishing second in the Rookie of the Year standings behind Jamie McMurray all showed that Greg had not come to find his footing. He had completed the adaptation phase before the rest of the field had time to name it. Greg's rhythm did not always align with what the track would tolerate. There were days when a light touch at high speed did not end at the next corner. The car was forced out of its familiar lane, gaps closed sooner than expected, and instinct shifted from preservation to response. Greg did not take those moments to the microphone. He handled them on the asphalt quickly, decisively, then returned to silence. Some incidents seemed minor, yet triggered a tighter lap, an unnecessary press, a refusal to yield at precisely the wrong moment. When that rhythm repeated, NASCAR stepped in, not to decide right or wrong, but to cut the chain of reactions before it carried itself beyond the limit. Afterward, Greg returned to the track as usual, the driving rhythm unchanged, no explanations offered. And it was precisely the speed with which everything reset that ensured what had happened did not disappear, but lingered quietly in how people remembered him. His achievements did not come from a single dominant moment, but from maintaining a standard long enough that his presence became impossible to ignore. As championship battles reached phases where teams were forced to accept risk in search of advantage, Greg remained a stabilizing axis throughout the season. He led many races, controlled the tempo for long stretches, and placed himself where every title, ambition, had to pass through. Not to be blocked, but to be measured. The celebration at the Ford 400, therefore, did not merely close a season. It closed a role. From that point on, Greg Biffle no longer needed to be identified as an ascendant figure, nor was he permitted to stand outside expectation. He entered a different state, one in which the very standards that had carried him forward became fixed measures, leaving no room for easing. Greg kept racing, retained the trust of the technical teams, and continued to do his job with familiar precision. The pressure now was no longer about proving capability, but about sustaining it within a system that was accelerating. Questions about leaving occasionally surfaced as a possible exit. There were conversations, suggestions other teams mentioned. But for Greg, departure was not a romantic leap. It was a risk equation, changing workflows, changing technical systems, changing a trust that had taken years to build. He was not quick to choose a decision that would force everything to start over. As NASCAR increasingly tilted toward risk and short-term decisions, Greg did not change his style. He kept the old rhythm, not because he could not do otherwise, but because it was the only rhythm he believed could be controlled over the long term. During those years, Greg began to see that the issue did not lie in the steering wheel. Roush did not suddenly weaken. It slowed as the sport came to be decided by details few noticed. The car grew less stable through small corners, the tires lost their life, and the driver had to intervene earlier by instinct. Greg did not complain. He simply recognized that there were days when he did everything right, yet the car no longer operated on the same plane. That shift did not create a rupture. Greg did not lose his place. He simply no longer stood where every movement had to pass. And within that space, life beyond the track began to carry a different weight. Open water, cockpits, stretches of travel without spectators. all became part of a new balance. There, Greg did not need victories, nor did he need to maintain an image. He only needed to ensure that everything returned safely. He began investing energy in work without grandstands, but with real responsibility. There were investments and operations tied to stable business models, work where results came not from a single weekend, but from months of holding rhythm. Aviation was not merely a hobby. It was a way to control schedules, distances, and safety standards according to principles Greg trusted. For him, bringing those closest along was not surrender. It was a way of keeping them within the same system, where risk was calculated rather than pushed beyond control. When he wanted to reconnect with competition without subjecting himself to the same cup-level pressure, he occasionally appeared in other forms of racing, from off-road events to experiential arenas like Lemons, where people raced to test limits without self-destruction. And in a corner few noticed, Greg spent time on animal rescue, working with the Lake Norman Humane Society, not as a declaration of compassion, but as a quiet habit. He did not cast himself as a hero. He simply did what needed to be done, in places where no one demanded that he win. These choices were not a retreat from racing, but a redistribution of responsibility, less placed on standings, more invested in a life he could directly control. From here, Greg's story gradually moved away from the track, not because his career had ended, but because what kept him grounded began to exist elsewhere. Personal choices, private relationships, and a life running parallel to fame. Quieter, yet more durable than any season. The body begins to respond differently after long races. Mornings are no longer clear. Fatigue arrives later, but it stays longer. Concussions do not appear on screens, yet they leave marks in the rhythm of everyday functioning. The Cup Series allows no room for even a fraction of a slowdown. When the car can no longer be placed in the competitive zone in the familiar way, continuing to be present becomes a burden. Retirement, then, ceases to be a word and becomes a decision, made before the gap widens any further. In 2006, when the racing calendar had grown so predictable it could be measured more by habit than expectation, Greg met Nicole Lunders during a stretch of life detached from the track. The meeting was not tied to a victory or a notable event. It unfolded within ordinary routines where Greg did not need to carry the role of a driver, and Nicole did not enter the NASCAR world out of curiosity or admiration. Nicole lived by a different rhythm. Weekends did not revolve around race schedules. Time was not split by events or travel. After returning from races, Greg began to have evenings that required no retelling of lines taken, no data analysis, and no preparation for the next day. Just meals at regular hours, scattered conversations, and the feeling of being at rest. The relationship grew through the repetition of small things. Greg adjusted his schedule more discreetly. He left the track earlier when possible, planned flights more carefully, and reserved rare pockets of time for a life not defined by competition. There were no declarations or defining moments. From that point on, Greg's life no longer revolved entirely around the track. In 2016, his marriage to Nicole came to an end. There were no public disputes, no prolonged statements. Greg remained silent, as he always did when facing matters that could not be handled by technique or experience. The separation did not erase the years they had shared, but it left a clearer absence in the cadence of daily life. After that point, Greg's life shifted into another state, less tethered to racing rhythms, less pulled by fixed schedules. He spent more time in spaces that did not require witnesses, aircraft cockpits, open water, work demanding absolute focus, but no audience. This was not a period of searching for something new, but of keeping life from falling out of rhythm. It was during this time that Greg entered a new private relationship, unpublicized, kept out of public view. He welcomed his son as someone who had already stepped away from the center of the spotlight. Fatherhood was no longer fragmented by dense racing schedules. Greg was present in small moments, arranging routines, driving back and forth, keeping daily life running smoothly. Responsibility no longer had to be balanced against a career. It became the central axis of his life. In 2023, Greg married Christina Grossu, the mother of his son. The relationship formed through compatibility of rhythm rather than a desire for change. Greg did not enter this family as someone needing to start over, but as someone who knew clearly what he could hold on to and what he needed to let go. Family at this stage did not signal a beginning. It formed a structure stable enough to exist within. From then on, Greg's life slowed in a very concrete way. Days were divided into clear segments, drop-offs, arrangements, short trips planned so that he would always return on time. Responsibility was no longer measured by form or position in NASCAR, but by the ability to keep daily routines running evenly, without interruption. Flying remained a familiar part of that life. For Greg, it was a way to maintain control over time and distance. He planned routes himself, reviewed paths, and often brought along those closest to him. The sky demands concentration and precise decisions. Things Greg had grown accustomed to handling throughout his career. The final flight was prepared according to that same habit, a journey considered reasonable within the context of a stabilized family life, part of a chain of ordinary choices. Everyone boarded with familiar trust. Greg took his usual seat, in a state of quiet focus, the same state that had followed him from the track into private life. The weather that day showed no unusual signs. The trip was expected to end as so many had before, landing, packing up, and resuming daily routines. No one on board understood that it would be the last time they were together. The accident happened in an instant. Initial data indicate the flight did not end in a straight plunge. The aircraft turned back towards Statesville Airport in an emergency condition, flying at very low altitude with landing configuration set, landing gear deployed, as an attempt to bring the plane down. The aircraft crashed and was completely destroyed, with fuselage and wing fragments scattered within a narrow radius, indicating a high-speed impact. An emergency message regarding an abnormal landing had been sent shortly before the crash. Witnesses near the airport described the plane appearing at unusually low altitude in an approach posture toward the runway before losing control. Rescue crews reached the site after the fire had subsided. The airframe was severely deformed, with no section intact enough to identify the original structure. Evidence at the scene suggests the accident unfolded too quickly to allow for reaction or escape. At present, investigators have not determined who was directly controlling the aircraft in the final seconds. More than one person on board was qualified to fly, and black box data will be decisive in clarifying this detail. The area was secured the same day. Authorities confirmed that all occupants of the aircraft died at the scene. Residents nearby reported hearing a single heavy sound, after which everything returned to silence. The collection of debris and data proceeded in an atmosphere of urgency and order. The flight ended abruptly. There was no space for hurried speculation or emotional interpretation. What remains is a clear reality. A familiar journey was cut short midstream. What makes this loss so heavy is not only the number of lives lost, but the fact that a way of living held together for many years, family, schedules, safety standards, was erased all at once, leaving no alternative behind. News of the crash quickly spread across international media. Bulletins were updated continuously, tickers scrolling across screens, images of the site repeated from multiple angles. But as time passed, the pace of coverage slowed. Short updates gave way to pauses, moments when anchors spoke less and allowed the name Greg Biffle to remain on screen longer than necessary. Within the NASCAR community, the reaction did not follow the usual pattern reserved for the loss of a star. There were no lengthy retrospectives, no attempts to rank a legacy. Drivers, teams, and commentators chose brevity, sometimes only a single sentence. He was always there. A driver you could hand the car to. We'll miss Greg's working rhythm. These remarks were not meant to elevate, but to confirm that the loss was real. The tracks continued to operate on their scheduled calendars, but in the paddock, the familiar cadence slipped. Those who had worked with Greg, from engineers and pit crew members to rival drivers, responded in the same way. They paused, then spoke. Messages appeared slowly, briefly, and at a distance, not to summarize a career, but to acknowledge that someone who had been there for so long could not be replaced by another name overnight. In official statements, teams and organizations avoided victories or statistics. The focus settled on a familiar quality: reliability. Greg was remembered as someone who kept a season in rhythm, who could bring a car through long races safely, who did his part without demanding the spotlight. It was recognition rooted in professional experience rather than spontaneous emotion. The broader media soon sensed this as well. The story shifted away from achievements and numbers toward a simple reality. Greg Biffle had been present in the sport for too long to disappear without leaving an indentation. That he was lost together with his entire family pushed the sense of loss beyond the boundaries of a career, touching the human life behind the lights. What lingered in many minds was not the detail of the accident, but the convergence of person and outcome. Greg Biffle was associated with discipline, risk control, and situational awareness. That he was lost in an aviation accident, where every decision likewise demands absolute precision, made the silence that followed heavier than any commentary. In the days that followed, Greg Biffle was mentioned just enough to affirm his place in NASCAR history. A durable driver, a keeper of rhythm, an individual who built a private life quietly. His passing, along with his family, did not close with declarations or grand rituals, but left behind a pause difficult to name, one in which people began to realize that some parts of the sport become clear only when they are no longer there. There is no neat, final chapter that can contain Greg Biffle. What he left behind does not live in statistics to be recited, nor in a handful of explosive moments easy to remember. It exists as a habit, grown familiar over time, stability maintained long enough to become foundational and therefore easy to take for granted. For many years, Greg's presence in NASCAR was not a pulling force or a disruptive point, but a component that kept the system running in time. The car came back intact. The race stayed within control. Pressure was absorbed rather than amplified. These things rarely made headlines, yet they were what colleagues, technical teams, and even rivals relied on, sometimes without realizing it. The way Greg lived off the track was not separate from this. He did not seek attention to validate himself, nor did he draw his private life into the glare of fame. Responsibility was placed where it belonged. Daily rhythms were kept steady. When the lights no longer shone directly, life continued to operate by the same principle. Do your part, then step away when needed. For that reason, Greg's absence did not produce a loud shock, but a slow sense of lack. No one replaced him in any direct sense, because what he brought was not a position or a role that could be transferred. It was the reassurance that a person sufficiently reliable was still present within the system, and only when that presence vanished did people realize how much they had leaned on it. When the numbers have been set aside, when races recede into distant memory, What remains is not speed or standings, but the steady cadence of responsibility upheld over time, on the track, within family, and in choices that required no audience. Greg Biffle leaves behind an operational void, as if someone quietly left the room, turned off the light, and closed the door very gently. Everything continues. Only from that moment on, the rhythm no longer quite fits as it once did.